Right, hi and welcome everyone to the Mobile UK Live Better Connected podcast. Now, today I'm quite excited because one of the key issues that Mobile UK has been campaigning on is better planning reform, essentially allowing us to build the networks quicker, more efficiently, and getting that 5G out to everyone as they need it. Now, we are talking today the YIMBY Initiative. We've got Maxwell Marlowe here today. So Max, before we start, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about TYI?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Gareth. My name is Maxwell Marlowe. I'm the Director of Policy at TYI, or the YIMBY Initiative. We are a cross-party research consultancy and stakeholder engagement group. I've been working on planning for a few years now, and I decided to take it to a more formal consultancy about this time last year with a few colleagues from the Labour Party. I sit on the centre-right, but what our overriding thing is looking at the planning system and trying to basically break down the barriers to growth and prosperity across the UK, of which we've done reports on the Building Safety Regulator all the way through to agriculture, and now here we are talking about mobile connectivity and the planning barriers that essentially slow down the nation. And it's so frustrating doing this sort of work because you see that, there's such small changes need to be made to really unlock massive amounts of investment and connectivity across the UK.
And we'll come into that. But I think it's really important. What's fascinating, planning to some is quite a detailed and sort of obscure area of regulation and law. But you've got quite a backing on this. You've got sort of cross-party support as well, especially from TYI themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. So the overriding thing that we concentrate on at TYI is trying to basically remove the political barriers to change. And, I've worked in think tanks previously where we can get a comment or a forward from a Conservative Reform member. Likewise, I have friends who work in other think tanks who can only really go to Labour and others. And whenever we go and talk to politicians, they go, yes, well, we'll have to, this is great research. We really agree with the proposals. But what about the political battle? How are we going to fight that? So what we try to do is essentially say, look, we'll go to, parties across the board. We'll get everyone to sign on to the same thing. And that really speeds up the process of getting change done. And we've had a lot of success with that previously. I don't see much difference here with this. So for this particular paper, which again is Small Changes, Big Rewards, we've got a forward by the Labour MP Sean Woodcock, who represents Banbury in Oxfordshire, which is quite a rural constituency. So a lot of farmers. It's quite old fashioned down there, but he's been, speaking to us. He says his constituency has connectivity problems. So, and likewise, I've been speaking to Conservative members about this. They also experience the same things. And there's also, the everyday people who don't just, live and work around Whitehall. I've got friends who work across the City of London, for example, who in the course of this research, I've spoken to them about what I'm up to. And they'd be saying, yes, this is absolutely fantastic, because they walk around outside. They can't get any signal, even though they're in, an apex city, an AAA city as it's ranked globally. So, it's been really important to get as much consensus on this piece of work as possible, because again, planning, as you said, Gareth, is so obscure. It's so, it's so menial to most people, but when push comes to shove and sort of stuff, it's politics that gets in the way. So knocking down planning and political barriers is what we're all about.
But it is planning that underpins the ability to build these networks. And looking at that title, I think that really sort of comes out quite quickly. So, it's small changes, big rewards, ensuring planning connects with mobile infrastructure. Now, what is it you mean by that? What does small changes, big rewards mean? What are you getting at there?
Absolutely. So what we've been clear here is we're not asking to rewrite the entirety of British planning legislation, nor are we asking to kind of overturn a lot of the legislation, which I think a lot of critics of more, of better planning regulation often say to people who want reform. What we're looking at here are small text changes to documents such as the General Permitted Development Rights Regime, and as well as the National Planning Policy Framework. Right? We're talking at small paragraphs, not small paragraphs, small lines, small sentences, just making it, updating legislation so that it brings it up to basically be able to, facilitate upgrades to masts, which is what we're looking at here fundamentally.
And Max, in changing that legislation, the small lines, as you say, sort of, as I understand it, the big point here is that this is looking at upgrades. If the fear from politicians is that essentially one, there's fear of eroding the planning system, and then it's about being able to build anywhere and anywhere. Now, I work within the industry, and certainly what we come across is that we're not trying to build anywhere and anywhere. We build on radio physics, we build where the demand is needed, and we build sensitively within the planning system. So, there's a key point here is that, this is not about being able to just put them wherever people are. And that's that sort of small change aspect. So to explain that a bit further.
Of course. So it's really interesting when you go through a lot of the research that I've been doing on this. When you read what people are saying about how they don't want, new masts in the area, you can sometimes you can understand them. If you live in a beautiful AONB, and you read a lot of tabloid headlines about this sort of stuff.
Area of outstanding natural beauty.
Of course, yes. Natural beauty. You read tabloids and you think, oh my gosh, the big telcos are going to build huge, massive masts outside of my front door. It's going to ruin my view. We've actually seen a lot of this push through with some of the rhetoric from, let's say, Reform, for example, who are scared about pylons. So people have this. It's not entirely factual, but it does push through to their complaints. What we're looking at here are rooftop installations, for example, that are already built. So there's a great example in the middle of Westminster. If I walk from St James's Tube to Parliament, and I look up and I can see on top of the old police building that there's a 5G mast. It's only got 3 antennae on the top of it. I look down on my phone and I go, well, that's strange. I've only got 4G signal here. So you dig in a bit more and you find out, well, that's because of the planning laws. They say you can only have a maximum of 3 antennae, in some of these conservation areas, right? That doesn't make much sense. And I did some more digging into this. I realized, well, actually, looking at a lot of the connectivity within our cities, for example, a lot of it's regulated in a very strange way. And what I think the paper pushes at is saying, actually, I know the big telcos don't want to be, swapping out Big Ben for a huge telecoms mast a la the BT tower. What they want to do is on the top rooftops, just add a couple more antennas, within the law, make it very gentle, very easy. You would never notice if you looked up. And that would massively increase the amount of connectivity for everyone. And again, nobody would notice. That's the great thing about, the small changes we're asking for.
So when you're saying small changes, it's about upgrading the existing network. It's and the footprint that it's already on. And to be fair, I mean, if we look back at, I think it was 2 years ago, there were changes to permitted development rights for new build. This is not about the new build. This is, and I think in your report, you say 95% of the build is upgrades. So I think some of that fear is unfounded.
Absolutely, it is really unfounded. I think it's remarkable. What I've seen when I've been going through a lot of the really good open source data out there, which looks at, where is the connectivity in London? And you start realizing in some of our busiest areas, there's either slow speed or kind of not spots, areas where people can't actually get any connectivity. And then, you speak to some of the providers and you go, well, why is this the case? And they go, well, actually, it's because, we tried to upgrade a master, the landowner said no. And therefore, the millions of people which trudge through certain areas of London are therefore deprived of it. So when I'm looking at this stat, this 95% of upgrades, it's absolutely right. They're just trying to bring, masts which already have planning permission. I think it's really important to emphasize that. They're not trying to relitigate the entire case of and justify putting up new infrastructure. They're trying to add just a little bit more on. All privately funded, by the way. There's no taxpayer expense whatsoever in doing this, to have ginormous amounts of public benefits. And that's not just using the map on my phone or whatever else. It's, if I stop off in areas of London, I want to get a coffee. A lot of the, payment infrastructure relies on 4G or 5G, for that transaction to happen. So it's unlocking large amounts of investment without trying to relitigate the case for planning permission. And
I have to stop you on one part there, because you just mentioned that at no cost to the taxpayer. And obviously mobile industry is privately funded. So what does that mean? I mean, we're asking for these changes and we'll come on to the impact that can bring. But, there are small changes that equally, elaborate on that, please. What does that mean in terms of no cost to the taxpayer?
Well, so I guess the only cost is the amount of time it takes for, drafters of legislation to actually write in, to the new regulations. It's a statutory instrument. that's then put in front of the House and then put forward. There are mechanisms to do that already. That is the only cost, because the telecommunications sector is basically sat on top of lots of capital that it wants to deploy in order to upgrade these masts. The taxpayer really has it's not going to spend a penny to do this. The money's already there, the capital's already there, the skills are already there to do this. This is unlike roads and ports and railways, which, because the government have an interest, a share in these areas, they have to deploy their own capital. They've got to publish their own, plans. The industry is already ready to do this, and you can see that actually there's actually an acknowledgement of that within a lot of the statements coming out of DCIT and also MHCLG. They're saying actually, we know the telecoms companies want to be investing here, and we want to update the rules to follow it. And I think that's where this paper leads, is saying you're right to do that, government. You should be doing that. Let's bring this up to date, and let's ensure that the people with the deep pockets can actually deploy the capital to best serve the British people, their customers.
And this is in stark contrast to, as you say, physical infrastructure, which often has billions of pounds of public investment and subsidy that goes to it. This is about removing the barriers to let the industry get on and build what they've already, I think it's in their pre-committed, plans to build this. And equally, it's about getting the 5G standalone that is being deployed out now to provide the capacity that people need to use it. Now, one of the things I sort of was keen on, again, we say small changes, big impact. And the impact here that you put in the report is sort of the economic impact as well. I mean, what does this give us? If these changes come in place, it can be then quite rapidly moved forward to actually then deploying. But what does that mean for you or me, for business, for the country as a whole?
Totally. So this is digital infrastructure, and what I really mean by the word infrastructure is that it permits other activity to occur because the investment's been made, right? So there are some studies which estimate that if you go forward with some of these changes that put forward, to have better regulation, around planning, the benefits are 5 to 1. That means for every pound a telecoms company spends, £5 will be generated in the local economy, because that activity has been allowed to go forward. So, just as an example of this, for example, so let's say, I want to get from A to B, and I want to use Google Maps on my phone. And because I don't have the right digital infrastructure, in my local area to permit me to use that maps thing, it means I'm not going to go forward and go to the pub and spend, £6, £7 on a pint, as we're seeing nowadays in London. That's by the by. But that economic activity will not occur if I cannot get from A to B, because I cannot access that digital infrastructure. Now multiply that across the entirety of the British economy. Let's take, for example, the government have, announced in June of last year, they said they want to, get railway journeys up to really high connectivity standard. Now, I was on the train on Tuesday. I was trying to have a call with, some of my clients at the time, and I couldn't have the call. What does that mean for me? That means that I'm cut out of the conversation. It means that I can't service my clients. And it also means that my clients can't get the feedback or insight that I provide. Fundamentally, it slows down business, right? So I think that's a big thing. But that's just on the private sector side, Gareth. There's also looking at our public services as well. So the NHS's 10-year health plan, it's really clear in that document. It says it wants to have all of its hospitals, old and new, 5G connected, ready for 5G, ready for digitization. And, bearing in mind the NHS is famously the home of the fax machine in the 21st century, they really do want to move forward and get 5G connectivity. The government aren't going to be building these masts. It's telcos that are, but they're held back by these small changes. But that also means that, patients and doctors are not being served by current infrastructure. So getting these changes through is just a win-win-win for literally everybody involved. It's, as I said, it's quite maddening doing this research, because you're looking at this stuff and going, why aren't we changing this now? This is absolutely absurd.
And equally, it goes further. Digital inclusion is a big element of this government. And we see statistics like sort of 95% of all job opportunities are only available online. You have people who often we see more and more statistics of places becoming mobile only homes. Because people are choosing one or the other in terms of connectivity, and they tend to want that personal connectivity, and so therefore mobile is becoming more and more important. But as you've mentioned, this isn't just necessarily today about just mobile phones being connected to the mobile networks. There are industrial uses coming through. And as we look to sort of what some have termed Industry 4.2, private networks, manufacturing hubs, all needing this ultra connectivity, logistics as well, it is really, really important. And it strikes me that, we have government ambitions for housing, we have government ambitions for data centers, but nobody wants to move into a house or into an area if it's not well connected. They don't want your data centers. A lot of all that computing power essentially will be utilized by people through their mobile phones.
Absolutely. This, it's what you're kind of touching on there, Gareth, is the Internet of Things, which, was initially, quite an academic idea about what happens if you connect lots of bits and pieces of your house or things you own to, to the internet. Fundamentally, I've got a strange story, which is that so my dad, is used to be quite a big management consultant. He went out to work for one of the big telcos, and in Europe, and they wanted to connect IoT to lots of things. This is early in 2010s. Didn't really work. The connectivity wasn't really there. Fast forward to now, and he can look at this stuff and go, yes, it's absolutely everywhere. IoT, it's really important. One of the big new things coming to London, which is being trialed and working really well in the US, is Waymo, which is autonomous vehicles.
That's the taxi service, isn't it?
That's a taxi service, which is that there is no driver. It's all done through AI, but it requires really good connectivity to operate. So it's not going to be out in the countryside. It's going to be in those cities, but they're really struggling to roll out in some areas, kind of all over the world, really, because of lacking connectivity. So that's just one small bit. But you're right, it's kind of the larger industrial strategy of this government is to have that, those hubs that are digitally connected, that allow people, to utilize these, this amazing Internet of Things. But again, it's not going to happen without that connectivity. So we need to really quite rapidly update our regulations, not overhaul them, just update them in order to, reap these massive rewards that are being offered, from Silicon Valley to London to Cambridge, wherever you mention it.
And it's key, as I think you mentioned earlier, this sort of enabling technology that we call it. It enables these to happen, and therefore the UK wanting to be at the forefront of global technology and being at the front of everything. It needs this technology in place now. This isn't something we can think about later. We've got to get this moving, and this is about those small changes. And again, just going back to some of those small changes that that are in the report, it just astounded me that some of them are, as you say, being able to just get additional antennas onto existing masts. And we're in a world now that people are looking at more sharing infrastructure. That again becomes more difficult if you can't share that infrastructure on that mast because of planning, or there are words within it about being on the exact same site. Again, if you're putting more antenna on a mast, it's probably going to have to take more weight and therefore maybe a slightly larger structure. But you may then have to move it slightly, a couple of centimeters to the left or right, and again we get stuck in planning because of that. And I think for those, if you do, please read it, because the changes are not, they are small. But there was another aspect in the report that you brought out, on what is called notice to quits. And this is essentially where existing infrastructure is have to move off a building because a developer is updating their building or demolishing a building. And that's existing coverage and capacity that is then lost. So what's the issue there?
So we find this a lot in London specifically because there's so much redevelopment that's ongoing in London, and of course, we're dealing with physics here, and fundamentally, it is the case that if you bring down a mast, it's going to lose, that area's going to lose connectivity. It's going to set off kind of a cascading effect throughout the network, wherein fundamentally, whole areas can go dark. So, at the moment, the notice to quit regime essentially says, well, if a developer wants to upgrade, demolish and rebuild a building or upgrade a building, whatever else, they need to have 18 months. They need to give a notice of 18 months to telecoms providers in order to go for relocation, for reassessment, to find suitable other sites, and then to essentially install new connectivity.
So that's the planning regulations that they have 18 months to do.
Exactly. And that's not a lot of time. When we look at it as a whole, think about what needs to happen in that 18 months. There's huge, a whole, series of systems need to suddenly kick in. And as soon as this happens, and, as you will know, and as listeners will know as well, the planning system and the complexities of the modern economy, things can get delayed, they can get pushed back. if you go over that 18-month period, whole areas are going to be knocked out from the modern digital economy. Right. So what I've asked for here is pushing that, a little bit further back, just to allow for, developers, just to step back from a moment, a developer is not going to just decide, within 18 months when they're not going to redevelop a building. They're going to need to source financing. They're going to need to source architecture. They're going to source, various consultants, builders, you name it. Buildings take a long time to be redeveloped. I find it baffling that, in the current system, that same regard is not given to connectivity. So what I've asked for here is for that NTQ regime to be updated, to align it a bit more, so it's a bit easier with a development cycle in order to get, the connectivity, to be as, almost as important as redeveloping the building itself. Because again, I'll come back to the point at the start. It's about physics. Yes, the building is going to be resurfaced on a single site. That's good for its residents. That's good for builders. That's good for the economy. But what about the people in the surrounding area who rely on the mast on that building? So it's only sensible that, as part of kind of the public space, that, these regulations are updated to fit both the timelines for telcos, but also for the local community.
The ask here is effectively about flexibility, especially with the temporary sort of use of temporary equipment. It's being able to find another site and going through that planning process and finding a permanent site, because ultimately a temporary site is not as good as a permanent site. And that's extending that period to 36 months. Now there's another side of NTQs as well. It's about operators being aware of development happening and essentially, stopping some sites going up that can knock out, let's say, a microwave link, or it impacts the capacity or impacts in the let's say the propagation of the signal because you've just built something right next to a mast that's going. Where does the report come on that?
So what I've suggested in there, and what I wouldn't do is amend the legislation, because I think it's a little bit too heavy-handed. But I would encourage planners to say to developers, developers should undertake a wireless connectivity impact assessment, right? So what does that mean? That means that in the same way that a planner has to, an architect has to do floor designs, it's got to do materials assessments, whatever else. I think what needs to go on, when they're undertaking that initial planning review, is how is this building going to affect wireless connectivity? And then that not only cognitively puts it on the mind of planners that, oh yes, we do need to start thinking about this because this is important, not just for the occupants of the building, of course, but for the local area, but also to say, looking at the design of the building. So what's been interesting with some of the work that TYI does with other companies, other sectors, is updating building materials. And there's a big push, as you'll be very well aware, for increased insulation, for example. Now, increased insulation and the change of materials is good for stopping heat and noise from transgressing between the building and outside. That also has an effect on 4G and 5G because we're dealing with similar physical properties. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration when they're looking at updating or upgrading buildings or whatever else. So again, I'm not asking here for, the same heavy hand of the state to come down and say, well, developers must take this into account. I think it's good to get it on their radar, and then they can start to engage with the providers in order to have those conversations early on, and also for planning committees to have those conversations early on, because we know it's important.
So there's a role here both on developers and the local authority, and ultimately, what will happen if this is this done the right way is that those developers, their buildings will have good connectivity. The local authority won't be either losing connectivity or actually gaining better connectivity. So it is a win-win here. Now, one of the areas I was quite keen or interested in the report is why is the UK different? I mean, what's the picture elsewhere?
Absolutely. So I usually like to do this when I undertake kind of reviews of British planning. I like to look around the world, and this comes for two reasons. One, I think it's interesting to highlight how the UK stands out with this. It's very unique planning infrastructure that started off obviously with the Town and Country Planning Act back in 1947. And it's kind of evolved all the way through. And then the other nice thing about doing this is when I go to speak to policymakers, when I speak to ministers and civil servants, and the first question that usually comes up is, that's great. Has this been tried anywhere else? So it's good to get that question sorted first. So what I was most drawn to really is two examples. So one is South Korea. So South Korea is very famous for having, it was the first country in the world to really launch 5G back in April 2019. And indeed, they've had a 5G standalone mandate, which is that all of those masts need to become 5G standalone, and they're looking to kind of roll that out. They also have the seventh fastest connectivity in the world, right? I think it's really important to highlight that. So the average resident of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, can experience 350 megabytes a second download. Compare that to, London, it's 103 megabytes. So they're 3 times ahead of us. So what they've done there is they've given kind of tax breaks and kind of free reductions for infrastructure investment. Fine. Okay. That's the way they choose to do it. We're not recommending the same here. We think that the telcos can do this on, with the current capital requirements that they've got. And, speaking to telcos during this, they've said exactly the same thing. They've also had government-led kind of coordination, as it's rolled out. I think that's also another option, that they've chosen to go through. That's the way their economy set up. The government's very much involved in the day-to-day. There's also the United States, which is, I think, is very interesting, which is that they've through the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, they've essentially come in and they've said, well, look, what we're looking to do is just, really change the rollout. So actually, you've got 60 days if you're a kind of planning authority to say yes or to say no. So it stops the dragging on. That's what we call shot clocks. And they also cap the fees. So there's a $500 initial fee, and then there's a $270 a year kind of per small cell fee, which goes through. And we've seen a really big increase in connectivity there. New York, 180 megabytes a second. Chicago, 175 megabytes a second. Again, compare that back to even one of the leaders for connectivity in the UK, that's Manchester, only 113 megabytes a second. So other countries have really gone forward and really embraced this. And I think I'll end with Germany. In June 2025, with their kind of Telecoms Amendment Act, it states very clearly in this act that it is in the overriding public interest to upscale connectivity. Now, Germany, it's classic. It takes a long time for things to be done. There's lots of processes, but they've made it clear from central government, this is an overriding public interest to get this telecommunications infrastructure rolled out and ready for about 2030, right? And therefore that means that the Länder, of which there are 16, unlike our 330 planning authorities in the UK, they now have an obligation to really take into account wireless connectivity. So until 2030, we'll see that, wash through, as always, as I said, with the German system. But it's really important to say, other countries are taking this deadly seriously. The UK government should also be taking this deadly seriously as we move forward into the rest of the 21st century.
I think what's interesting is again, reiterating that point that you're not looking here to replicate other countries. We're saying actually with small changes to the existing system, we can supercharge and turbocharge the 5G rollout. And I think it's worth, pointing out at this stage that, the government has, it has permitted development rights reform on the table, and equally the National Planning Policy Framework. These are both consultations that have gone out and industry has fed into. And we need those changes to happen fairly quickly, and we want to work with the government to ensure that happens. And I think, certainly on the National Planning Policy Framework, the ask from industry is very much ensuring that economic and social need balance is stronger, because, this isn't a technology that is a nice to have anymore. It's a necessity. And I think just in conclusion, you mentioned sort of breaking the cycle of delay here. It's ensure we're not late this time, and ensure that we reform the system to enable this to happen.
Totally. And it's been, we don't just look at TOI, we don't just look at housing and planning, we also look at other things. So we've got a big work stream at the moment on quantum technology, which, the UK is a real leader at, just as we were leaders with AI. Right. And I think it's interesting that we've lost the race there because things were slow to update. We haven't lost the race. America really took off, and China as well. We've got a really good opportunity here to really supercharge ourselves with this area and not lose the race as we move forward with new technologies. And, on your website, Gareth, on Mobile UK's website, you've got a really good statement on there which says that, between the 1990s and today, you've gone from 0 to 7.2 billion. Right, in terms of people who are now using connectivity. It's important that we keep up to date with this sort of stuff and really have a future thinking, forward looking view for how we keep, our connectivity going. Because you're right to point out, Gareth, this is no longer a nice to have. It's not just a nice thing to have a bit of 5G every now and again. This is absolutely critical for the modern world. And I really do urge, the government, people who read this paper, going forward, to encourage these updates to be brought forward so that we can all be connected in what is, a rapidly moving and evolving world.
Maxwell, firstly, thank you for talking with me. I think, I have the report here, small changes, big rewards, and I think it's really worth reading. It really sort of puts this in context, what the changes being asked are, what the impact they will have. Please download that. We'll put a link in the description. Everyone, I'd like to thank you once again for listening to the podcast. Please do hit that like and subscribe, and we look forward to speaking to you on the next one as it comes. Thank you all.